Hey guys, tonight we step into one of the most unsettling deathbeds in English history, where Henry VIII, the king who once shook all of Europe, ended his life in darkness, rot, and the haunting shadows of the very people he sent to the scaffold. Picture this. London, January 1547. Inside the cold chambers of Whitehall Palace, the man who defied the Pope, who altered the fate of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Howard, is now nothing more than a massive, suffering body trapped on his bed. Tonight, we won't merely revisit his 6 tragic marriages or the birth of the Anglican Church. What we're truly chasing is a question that has echoed for centuries. What transformed the young spring prince, handsome, athletic, brilliant, into a paranoid tyrant, easily enraged, mentally unstable, tormented by ulcerated wounds until his final breath? Did it all begin with that devastating fall from his armoured horse in 1536 that may have damaged his brain? Or does the answer lie in a rare genetic condition that killed nearly all his children and pushed Henry's mind into irreversible decline? Tonight, we peel back layers of medical mystery and ancient chronicles to understand why a king who once held absolute power died in isolation, foul breath, and fevered visions inside a chamber thick with the smell of death. Asterisk. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your local time zone. It's always fascinating to know we're all drifting into the night from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In January of 1547, London sank into a cold, wet heaviness, the kind that clings to stone walls and lingers in narrow streets. The air itself seemed to carry a quiet warning, thick with the scent of decay. Inside Whitehall Palace, once a place of music, feasts, and the unquestioned authority of the crown, there was now only the laboured breathing of a man nearing the end of his life. Henry VIII, the king who had broken the authority of the Pope, who had reshaped the faith of an entire nation, who had taken 6 wives and sent 2 of them to their deaths, was dying. And he was not simply dying, he was dying in agony, in a slow unravelling that mirrored the storms of his entire reign. The man the world once saw huge, proud, legs firmly planted as though challenging the earth itself had vanished. Beneath the layers of velvet, fur, and jewels, the body that had once symbolized strength and majesty was now decaying, trapped within the suffering it could no longer command. It was a collapse that revealed more about him than any victory, decree, or battlefield could ever reveal. This was the story of Henry's final days, sorrowful, heavy with the smell of rot, covered in shadows, yet reflecting every cruelty, ambition, and hunger for power that had marked his life. It was also a story of profound loneliness, the kind that clings to a man who spent decades ruling others but could never rule the demands of his own heart. Before his body failed him, before disease hollowed out the figure that once inspired awe, there had been moments rarely spoken of now when Henry embodied the very ideals of a Renaissance prince. There was a time when he was admired not only for his authority, but for his charm, his intelligence, and his physical grace. Long before the weight of the crown grew unbearable, long before the anger and paranoia consumed him, Henry had been a symbol of beauty and hope in a kingdom desperate for stability after years of civil war. That early promise was real, even if history has mostly forgotten it beneath the scandals that followed. But now, in the winter of his final year, all of that seemed impossibly distant. The damp London fog pressed against the palace windows like a shroud, and each corridor of Whitehall echoed with the quiet dread of those who served the king. They moved carefully, speaking softly, as though afraid the slightest sound might disturb the fragile boundary between life and death. Servants who had once obeyed his booming commands now approached his chamber with hesitation, mindful of the suffering within. Henry lay swollen and feverish, trapped inside a body that no longer resembled the man he once was. The skin beneath the sheets was discoloured, fragile, and marked by the long decline he had endured. His breaths were slow and uneven, carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of the wounds that had haunted him for years. The palace, once alive with dancers, musicians, ambassadors, and courtiers, had fallen into a hush broken only by the faint crackle of torches and the king's ragged exhalations. Outside his chamber, the empire he had reshaped continued to move, but within those walls, time felt suspended. Those who remembered the young Henry, the bright-haired prince who rode fearlessly, who played instruments with astonishing skill, who debated theology as an equal among scholars, could barely reconcile that image with the man suffering before them. His early kindness, his curiosity, and his love of life had long been overshadowed by his rages, his obsessions, and the ruthless decisions that had cost so many their lives. Yet even as he lay dying, those earlier qualities still mattered, if only as fading echoes. They reminded the few who had known him before, power hardened his heart, that no king, no matter how feared or adored, begins as a monster. Henry's story had not always been dark. But now, at its end, darkness seemed to be all that remained. The cold January nights deepened around Whitehall. Snow melted into slush along the Thames, and the wind carried the distant toll of church bells. Inside the dimly lit chamber, the once mighty king shifted painfully, his body weakening under the weight of each passing hour. The grandeur of his reign, the powerful gestures, the victories, the marriages, the proclamations, all of it seemed impossibly far away, swallowed by the solitary struggle of these final moments. And so this chapter of Henry's life, shaped by ambition, authority, brilliance, and brutality, began its slow, inevitable close, not with triumph or spectacle, but with the quiet surrender of a man who had spent his life commanding others, yet could not command death to wait. In his youth, Henry VIII possessed a beauty so striking that foreign ambassadors struggled to find words adequate to describe him. Sebastian Justinian, the Venetian ambassador, wrote of a young man whose face was almost delicate in its symmetry, smooth and fair like that of a woman, yet framed by hair the colour of polished copper. Henry's skin was pale and luminous, his eyes alert with vitality, and his figure tall, well over 1 metre and 80 centimetres, an exceptional height for the early 16th century. His calves were finely shaped, his shoulders broad, and his posture carried the effortless brilliance of a Renaissance prince who seemed born for admiration. When he ascended the throne in the year 1509, not yet 18 years old, Henry embodied everything a kingdom recovering from turmoil might hope for. He was charming, intelligent, and endlessly energetic. He played the lute and the organ, composed songs and verses, debated theology with scholars, spoke English, French, Latin, and a little Italian, and collected books with the enthusiasm of a true humanist. Above all, he loved the physicality of life, hunting through deep forests, charging in tournaments with a lance under his arm, and testing his strength on the field in games that demanded both courage and agility. To his subjects, he became the Prince of Spring, a symbol of renewal for an England emerging from nearly 30 years of civil war. The nation saw in him a promise, a bright beginning after generations, marked by uncertainty, bloodshed, and shifting dynasties. His presence alone, glowing with youth and confidence, carried the sense that the world might finally settle into peace. Yet beneath that radiant exterior was another nature quietly forming, one that only revealed itself in small, telling actions. A few days after taking the crown, Henry ordered the arrest and eventual execution of 2 senior ministers who had served his father. The official charge was treason, but the truth, whispered through court corridors, was far more prosaic. They had imposed taxes displeasing to the nobility. It was a gesture both decisive and cold, and it hinted at a future in which absolute power would rest in the hands of a man who expected loyalty, was quick to anger, and tolerated no challenge to his will. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon, his devoted first wife, prayed fervently for a healthy son. She carried the weight of dynastic expectation, understanding that the stability of the Tudor line depended on her ability to give the realm a male heir. Her pregnancies were many, and each loss carved new sorrow into the palace walls. A stillborn daughter, an infant son who lived only a few weeks, and other children who never survived long enough to take their first breath. By the year 1516, only one child remained living. Mary, a daughter cherished but insufficient in the eyes of a dynasty, hungry for a prince. Henry's reaction to these tragedies was complex. Outwardly, he continued hunting, competing, feasting, and performing his royal duties with vigor. But within, frustration grew, and with it a willingness to take drastic measures in pursuit of his desires. While Catherine grieved and prayed, Henry drifted into the darker currents of politics and personal ambition. He began to see his lack of a male heir not as misfortune, but as an obstacle that must be removed, no matter the cost. His early charm and gentleness slowly eroded, replaced by a temperament quick to fury and deeply sensitive to any hint of failure. Modern medical theories attempt to explain these repeated losses and the emotional tension they brought. Some researchers suggest that the tragedies endured by Catherine may have stemmed from Henry's own body, from a genetic complication not understood at the time, one capable of dooming pregnancies and plunging the royal family into cycles of hope and heartbreak. Though the people of that era could not identify the cause, the pattern of stillbirths and early deaths hung over the Tudor household like a silent curse. As the years moved forward, the vibrant prince whom ambassadors once praised began his slow transformation. The path ahead would lead him toward decisions that reshaped England forever. But in these early days, before the wives, before the executions, before the schism with Rome, the seeds of that transformation were already quietly taking root. And the kingdom, still basking in the glow of its young monarch, could not yet see the shadow stretching from his future back into his past. When age pressed closer, Henry grew larger and heavier, yet he continued to throw himself into jousts and hunts with the same stubborn passion that had defined his youth. His armor strained against his expanding frame, and his steps grew slower, but he refused to surrender the activities that once made him feel invincible. He had endured several smaller accidents over the years, falls, bruises, and blows that would have humbled another man, but none compared to the catastrophic event that awaited him in the year 1536. By that time, he had broken his long marriage to Catherine of Aragon and placed Anne Boleyn on the throne beside him. His longing for a son had turned into a quiet desperation, a desire that seemed to sharpen the edges of his temper and shadow his every decision. Anne had given him Elizabeth, brilliant, bright-eyed, destined for greatness, though no one could yet imagine how great. But every pregnancy after that brought only grief. Each hope dimmed, each expectation ended too soon. Then came the 24th day of January of that cruel year. The winter air hung cold and grey above the jousting field, as Henry, armoured and determined, prepared himself for yet another contest. His war-horse, massive, powerful, weighing nearly 500 kilograms, snorted clouds of mist into the air. The king spurred forward, intent on proving that age had not dulled him, that strength still pulsed in his limbs. But in a single terrible moment, the world shifted. Something went wrong, no one later could agree on the details, and Henry was thrown violently from the saddle. The great beast collapsed onto him, its full weight crashing down, crushing him against the frozen ground. For 2 hours he lay unconscious, unmoving, as those around him panicked in whispers and hurried footsteps. Courtiers clustered at the edges of the field, hushed and pale, unsure whether their king still breathed. Word spread through the palace like a rising tide, dark, heavy, unstoppable. Some believed he had already died. Some feared the kingdom would tear itself apart before dawn. Servants trembled, and even seasoned soldiers felt a nervous chill creep down their spines. Anne Boleyn, already living with the pressure of producing a male heir, received the devastating news while carrying a child. The shock struck her with a force deeper than any physical blow. By the time the day ended, on the very day Catherine of Aragon was buried, Anne miscarried, and the child she lost, painfully, heartbreakingly, was a son. The single thing she needed most, the single chance she had to secure her future, slipped away in the same breath that carried news of the king's collapse. That tragedy shattered her last fragile hope, but the impact of that day marked Henry even more deeply. After the year 1536, something in him changed. The cheerful, learned, courteous king described in earlier accounts began to fade like a distant memory. In his place emerged a man whose temper flared without warning, whose moods shifted like sudden storms, whose suspicions grew sharper and more consuming. His rage became unpredictable, his fears more intense, and his commands often contradicted one another. Those who served him learned to move carefully, speaking softly, uncertain of which version of Henry they might encounter. This dramatic shift led many observers then and now to suspect a significant brain injury. Before this accident, Henry had already suffered multiple falls from horses, each leaving lingering migraines that troubled him long after the wounds healed. But the accident of 1536 was more violent, more destructive. The sudden force of the massive horse crashing onto his body could easily have caused unseen damage, especially in an age when medicine could not look beneath the skull or understand the delicate architecture of the brain. Historians studying the records of his behavior Note how abruptly his personality seemed to turn. What had been mild impatience became explosive anger. What had once been confidence turned into suspicion. What had once been sharp intellect began slipping into confusion and forgetfulness. Some modern scholars suggest that damage to the frontal regions of his brain, the parts that govern judgment and impulse, might explain the erratic and often cruel behavior that dominated the rest of his reign. Whether this is the full truth, no one can say. But the pattern seen in the chronicles of the time is unmistakable. The Henry, who eventually opened his eyes after 2 hours of unconscious stillness, was not the same man who had mounted his armored horse earlier that morning. Something had shifted quietly, deeply, and permanently. From that moment on, the harshest years of Henry's rule began to unfold. The king, who rode into tournaments with laughter and music, became a ruler whose shadow inspired fear. The accident did not merely injure his body, it fractured something far more delicate, and the consequences would echo through every decision he made in the years that followed. After the accident, Henry's body began to decline with alarming speed, as though the single moment beneath the weight of the falling horse had set loose a slow, unstoppable collapse inside him. The change did not come in a single day, but unfolded over weeks and months, a quiet unraveling that pulled him farther and farther from the powerful figure he once had been. Physicians of later centuries would suggest that the traumatic blow to his skull might have damaged the pituitary gland, the tiny organ responsible for balancing the body's hormones. Such an injury could lead to uncontrolled weight gain, a shrinking of muscle, a steep drop in vitality, and even impotence. Though no one of his time could see the hidden wound within his head, the symptoms that followed seemed to echo those modern theories. Anne Boleyn herself had complained about Henry's decline in the bedroom, complaints that were certainly shaped by her own desperation and fear, but which nonetheless hinted at the truth of his condition. Whatever the exact cause, one fact remained unmistakable. Henry grew enormous. His weight climbed to around 180 kilograms, and his waist expanded to more than 140 centimeters. Royal tailors struggled to keep up with his changing measurements, and courtiers whispered that the king no longer resembled the lithe, graceful prince of his youth at all. At last, he could scarcely move on his own. He was so burdened by flesh and pain that a special litter, a kind of wheeled frame carried by servants, became necessary to transport him through the palace corridors. Yet even this physical transformation was not the worst of his suffering. Far more terrible were the wounds on his legs, lingering injuries from the catastrophic fall. At first, they appeared harmless enough, but over time they grew angry and open, turning into deep, agonizing ulcers that refused to heal. They became infected again and again, swelling, reddening, and filling with foul-smelling fluid. Witnesses wrote that the stench drifting from Henry's legs could be detected from 3 rooms away, an odor so overpowering that even loyal attendants struggled to remain near him for long. Doctors, lacking the tools and knowledge of later generations, resorted to brutal methods to manage the infections. They cut deep into his flesh with heated metal instruments, using the searing heat to drain the pus and keep the wounds from sealing too quickly. Each treatment must have felt like fire pressed against raw skin, yet it offered only temporary relief. And with every new wave of pain, the king's temper worsened. Once the terror of Europe, Henry now found himself tormented by his own body, pushed into greater irritability, cruelty, and emotional instability. All of this unfolded while he stubbornly clung to a diet as unhealthy as it was extravagant. Henry feasted on red meat, game, butter, cheese, rich pastries, and heavy sweets. He drank wine and beer daily, often in quantities that would overwhelm an ordinary man. Vegetables were almost entirely absent from his meals, for he believed them to be food suited for peasants, not kings. This indulgent diet, combined with his injuries, pushed him into a cascade of illnesses: heart disease, diabetes, gout, and dangerously high blood pressure. These conditions crept slowly through his body, weakening him from the inside even as infection gnawed at him from the outside. And still, Henry refused to yield. Clinging to the remnants of the king he once had been, he forced himself to ride, to hunt, to inspect fortresses along the borders. His pride resisted the idea that his body could betray him. Even as his legs throbbed with pain, even as he struggled to climb onto a horse without assistance, he insisted on maintaining the rituals that had defined his power and identity since his youth. Servants watched with growing alarm as he pushed himself beyond his limits, driven by memory more than strength. But the body has its boundaries, and Henry's had already been crossed. The day eventually came when no amount of determination could override the swelling, the infection, and the sheer weight he carried. The hunts had to stop. The rides had to end. The fortifications he once inspected with enthusiasm were left to others. The king, who had once galloped through forests, now could barely move from one chamber to another without being carried. In this long, painful decline, Henry's physical suffering intertwined with his emotional unraveling. The more his body betrayed him, the more volatile his temper became, and the more those around him trembled at his commands. What had begun with a single accident now echoed through every corner of his life, tightening around him like an invisible grip. And day by day, the mighty ruler found himself trapped not by enemies nor by rival kings, but by the slow, merciless failing of his own flesh. In the final years of his life, Henry was tormented by fevers that rose and fell like restless tides, by ulcers that oozed and burned, and by breaths so heavy they seemed to scrape the air from his lungs. His body, once broad and powerful, had become a failing vessel. Modern physicians believe he suffered from peripheral vascular disease, a condition that would explain the constant pain in his legs, the difficulty of circulation, and the relentless infections that wore him down day after day. Alongside that came heart failure, severe obesity, overwhelming infections, and blood pressure that rose to dangerous heights. Every symptom seemed to fold into the next, weaving a net of suffering that tightened around him with each passing month. There was another theory, too controversial, unsettling, yet strangely plausible. Some scholars suggest that Henry carried the rare Kell blood type, a genetic trait that could explain why the children he conceived with Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn so often died in the womb, or survived only a short time after birth. According to this hypothesis, a man who possessed the Kell antigen could father a first child without issue, but later, pregnancies with a Kell-negative mother might trigger the mother's immune response, silently sabotaging the developing fetus. In Henry's case, the pattern seemed hauntingly consistent. One surviving daughter with each woman, followed by repeated losses that weighed heavily on the royal household. If Henry truly carried the Kell antigen, then after the age of 40, he might have entered the early stages of McLeod syndrome, a rare disorder that could cause cardiomyopathy, abnormalities in movement, and profound psychological changes. The symptoms listed by modern researchers: paranoia, emotional instability, aggressive outbursts, and cognitive decline, mirror, with unsettling accuracy, the descriptions of Henry after the year 1536. His sudden rages, his unpredictable decisions, and his cold detachment from those around him may not have been solely products of power or temperament, but the echoes of a deeper, hidden illness slowly consuming his mind. Yet for all the theories that scholars propose, none can be proven with certainty. There are no medical scans, no preserved tissues, no definitive records, only the accounts of courtiers who watched him suffer and the chronicles written by those who feared him. Still, every explanation, whether rooted in trauma, genetics, or lifestyle, points toward the same unyielding truth. Henry was destroyed by his own body. The mighty frame that once carried him through tournaments and battlefields had become a prison of throbbing pain and decay. The constant agony isolated him from those who served him. He became suspicious, curt, quick to anger. His moods shifted without warning, and those around him learned to tread softly, for even a harmless remark could spark a royal command that ended in an execution. The man who had once decided the fate of thousands now found himself trapped inside flesh that rotted slowly from within. Every movement brought pain. Every breath reminded him that his body no longer obeyed him. And with each day, the walls around him grew tighter, the corridors darker, the air heavier, with the odours of sickness that seeped from his wounds. The King of England, once the embodiment of strength, ambition, and unstoppable force, was now confined to rooms that reeked of infection. Whitehall, the palace where he had once hosted glittering feasts and received ambassadors from across Europe, became the setting of his long decline. Night after night, as fever blurred his vision and memory faltered, shadows gathered around his bed like silent witnesses. It was in this dim, suffocating space that his past returned to him not as triumphs, but as ghosts. Every decision, every betrayal, every act of cruelty seemed to hover at the edges of his consciousness, flickering in and out of the fever-drenched darkness. And so, the story began to drift, inevitably, toward the final chapter of his life. Toward the nights in which the walls of Whitehall seemed to close in, toward the moments when his breath rattled in his chest, toward the stillness that followed each wave of pain. In those last days, surrounded by the stench of decay and the weight of his own history, Henry faced what he had outrun for decades, a reckoning woven from the very fabric of his own choices. In truth, no matter how many medical theories have been proposed about Henry VIII, none can say with certainty what illness ultimately consumed him. The idea that he suffered from syphilis has long been dismissed, for his symptoms simply do not match the expected pattern. Instead, modern physicians return to what is clearer, more grounded in observable fact. The repeated head injuries throughout his life, the catastrophic fall in the year 1536, his extreme obesity, his dreadful diet almost entirely devoid of vegetables or fruit, and the gradual decline in physical activity as pain and weight overtook him. These factors alone are enough to explain heart disease, vascular damage, kidney strain, gout, dangerously high blood pressure, and the deep, relentless pain that throbbed through his legs. Yet some researchers, notably Katrina Banks-Whitley and Cara Kramer, opened a different path of inquiry. Rather than focusing only on the king's physical ailments, they turned their attention toward the tragic pregnancies of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. So many miscarriages, so many stillborn children, so many infants who died shortly after birth, yet both women produced exactly one surviving child. For Catherine, it was Mary. For Anne, it was Elizabeth. After those daughters, the pattern was heartbreak, repeated again and again. Whitley and Kramer proposed that the explanation might lie not with the queens, but with Henry himself. They suggested the possibility of Kell blood group incompatibility, a rare scenario in which a father who carries the Kell antigen can inadvertently place future pregnancies at risk if the mother does not carry it. In a first pregnancy, the baby may be born healthy, but during that pregnancy, the mother forms antibodies. Those antibodies, in later pregnancies, cross the placenta and attack a Kell-positive fetus, leading to late-term miscarriages or extremely fragile newborns who may not survive long. When mapped against Catherine's and Anne's experiences, the pattern fits with eerie precision. Both bore exactly one child who lived. Both then suffered repeated losses at later stages of pregnancy. And if Henry did indeed carry the Kell antigen, the consequences would not have stopped there. After the age of 40, he might have begun developing symptoms of McLeod syndrome, a rare disorder linked to Kell genetics. Its effects include cardiomyopathy, abnormal motor function, and profound psychological changes. The behavioral symptoms associated with McLeod syndrome, paranoia, mood swings, aggression, cognitive decline, align unsettlingly well with the descriptions of Henry after the year 1536. His abrupt temper, his forgetfulness, his bursts of fury, the contradictions in his commands, these could, in theory, be traced not to the throne, nor to political stress, but to a hidden genetic condition, quietly shaping the final decades of his life. But for all its elegance, the Kell hypothesis remains only that a hypothesis. The truth is that the Tudor world was filled with dangers invisible to modern eyes. Infants died from infections caught within minutes of birth. Women miscarried because midwives and physicians did not wash their hands. Food spoiled easily. Medical knowledge was primitive at best. A baby could perish from a single moment of contamination or a small error in judgment. As for Henry, even without invoking rare genetics, his downward spiral can be explained by the sheer weight of his physical condition. Obesity on the scale, he reached around 180 kilograms, combined with a sedentary lifestyle, constant indulgence in heavy foods, and multiple severe injuries, would be enough to produce heart failure, vascular collapse, chronic infection, and a personality strained by constant pain. Any modern doctor, looking only at those factors, would see a man destined for the suffering described in the chronicles of his time. In the end, all theories, whether rooted in trauma, diet, genetics, or the simple brutality of 16th century medicine, lead back to one haunting truth. Henry was undone by his own body. The king who once inspired awe across Europe found himself trapped within decaying flesh, weakened by infections, tormented by wounds that refused to heal. The pain isolated him, narrowed his world, sharpened his suspicions, and deepened his volatility. The ruler, who had once decided the fate of thousands, now spent his days battling the slow collapse of his own health. His body, once a symbol of power, had become a dim, painful echo of the man he had been. And as this decline crept on, day after day, the story began drifting toward its final, inevitable destination. The dim chamber in Whitehall where the smell of rot clung to the air, and where the ghosts of his life, his choices, his sins, his regrets gathered like silent figures at the edge of his fevered sleep. From those medical debates, the story circles back to a colder, more unsettling question. Was it illness and physical agony that turned Henry into a monster, or had that always been his truest nature, merely stripped of restraint, once nothing remained to hold it in check? No answer exists. No historian, no doctor, no witness of his age can say with certainty. But what is certain, achingly, undeniably certain, is that in the final years of his life, Henry was imprisoned within his own body. His world shrank to the size of a few dim, suffocating rooms. And the king, who had once commanded continents of influence, found himself trapped in a failing vessel of flesh that betrayed him more with every passing day. The ulcers on his legs burned, throbbed, and split open again and again. They seeped pus, they refused to heal, and they filled the air with a smell so overpowering that anyone entering his chamber instinctively recoiled. Servants tried to mask it with herbs, oils, and heavy fabrics, but the odor clung stubbornly to every corner of the room, like a shadow that never lifted. His physicians worked tirelessly, draining the wounds, applying ointments, cutting into the inflamed skin when the pressure grew too much, yet the pain always returned, sharper, deeper, wearing him down until even breathing felt exhausting. Still, Henry tried to rule. He continued issuing commands, thinking about war, signing documents with an unsteady hand. But now, all of this happened within the narrow boundaries of a few chambers in Whitehall. The king, who had once travelled across his kingdom, hunting through forests and inspecting fortresses, found himself confined to bed or chair, surrounded by pillows, blankets, and the constant rustle of attendants moving quietly in the dim light. By the end of the year 1546, the struggle became too great. He was forced to abandon his journeys, forced to abandon hunting, forced to give up the pride of personally surveying border defences. His body, swollen and aching, simply could not carry him any longer. Thus, Henry returned to Westminster, settling into the vast palace he had seized years earlier from Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the loyal adviser whom he had later condemned. The irony of dying in a place taken from a man he betrayed seemed lost on no one. Within those enormous rooms, filled with tapestries, silverware, carved chests, paintings, statues, and embroidered fabrics, every object seemed to whisper a fragment of the past. These were not just decorations but relics of those who had once walked boldly through the corridors, only to end their lives at Henry's command. Each chair carried a memory, each locked chest, each golden cup, each panel of wood carved with Gothic patterns held a name, a story, a shadow. Many belonged to men Henry had sent to the scaffold, counsellors he had trusted, rivals he had feared, servants who had risen too quickly and fallen just as swiftly. Others had belonged to wives he had loved, neglected, accused, or ordered to death. In the feverish haze of his final months, one can imagine him seeing their faces flickering at the edges of candlelight. Catherine of Aragon's quiet sorrow, Anne Boleyn's sharp intelligence, Catherine Howard's youth and terror, the calm gaze of ministers who had once stood beside him, only to be abandoned in moments of suspicion. Surrounded by these silent echoes, Henry became increasingly paranoid. The feeling of being watched, haunted, cornered by the weight of his own deeds, grew heavier. After decades of political battles, betrayals, punishments, and shifting loyalties, he could no longer trust anyone. Every whispered conversation behind a closed door sounded like a threat. Every rustle of clothing in the hallway could have been a plot. And so his world narrowed further. In the end, only two men were granted regular access to the dying king's chamber: Sir Anthony Denny, the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. These two alone were allowed to stand beside him, to approach his bed, to speak in low voices as fever shimmered beneath his skin. They saw him in moments of clarity and moments of delirium, heard his laboured breathing, witnessed his drifting thoughts as they tangled with pain and memory. Outside his door, the palace continued its slow rhythms. But for Henry, the world had collapsed into a single dim room filled with shadows, regrets, and the restless ghosts of a life lived in excess, ambition, and brutality. The king who had reshaped England with iron, will now face the quiet unraveling of all power, held captive by a body that no longer obeyed him and by a past that refused to let him go. In January of the year 1547, no one inside the palace doubted that death was approaching, though fear kept every tongue still. Henry's body was swollen, his limbs heavy with fluid, and the infected ulcers on his legs had turned into deep, rotting wounds that refused to heal. Each breath slid from him like a blade, sharp and uneven, scraping at his lungs. The smell of decay drifted from his chambers into the corridors, thick enough to cling to the clothes of anyone who passed by. Servants tried to disguise it with herbs and smoke, but nothing could cover the sour, sickening odor seeping from the king's failing flesh. Everyone understood what the signs meant, but in Henry's court, stating the obvious could be fatal. A single careless remark about the king's imminent death could be judged as treason, as an insult to royal authority. Courtiers who had seen the king condemn men for far less chose silence over honesty. And so, while Henry lay in his bed in Whitehall, sweating through fever and shivering from pain, those around him whispered only behind closed doors, terrified that the walls themselves might carry their words to the wrong ears. In the end, it was Anthony Denny who stepped forward, the only one willing to risk his life by telling the truth. He entered Henry's chamber quietly, moving through the dim light cast by dying candles, and approached the king's bedside with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. In a calm, measured voice, he told Henry that no man could conquer death, that the moment had come to prepare himself for God. It was an act of courage few would have dared. But Henry did not explode in fury. He did not accuse Denny of treachery or lash out as he once might have. Instead, he remained still, as though the words had merely confirmed something he had long carried within himself. He asked to see Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had stood by him through the bitter, historic break with Rome. Messengers rushed through the freezing corridors to summon him. By the time Cranmer arrived, Henry's strength had all but vanished. His voice was gone, drained by fever and exhaustion. His skin glistened with sweat. His eyes drifted in and out of focus, and every movement of his chest seemed to cost him more than the one before. Cranmer leaned close to the king, speaking softly, urging him to trust in Christ and commend his soul to divine mercy. Henry could not answer, but with the last of his strength, he lifted his hand and gripped Cranmer's fingers. It was a faint, trembling squeeze, yet it spoke more clearly than words, a muted, final gesture of belief, fear, or surrender. That moment, quiet and fragile, was the last true act of Henry's long, tumultuous life. During the night between the 27th and 28th of January, Henry VIII died at the age of 56, after 37 years on the throne. His final breath passed not with ceremony or grandeur, but with a low rattle in a darkened room filled with fever, smoke, and whispered prayers. As dawn approached, a heavy silence settled over Whitehall. The doors were shut. Attendants moved slowly, as though the air itself had thickened. His body was embalmed only roughly, the work done in haste. Resin, incense, and thick clouds of aromatic smoke were burned around him to dull the odor rising from a corpse already beginning to break down. The great royal seal was destroyed, marking formally the end of Henry's rule. Yet the news of his death was not allowed to leave the palace. For 3 full days, the king's passing was kept secret. Behind locked doors, the council worked to secure the succession for Edward, the frail, delicate boy who was now the sovereign of England in name alone. Their fear was palpable. Fear of rebellion, fear of uncertainty, fear of what might follow a king's death in a kingdom still divided by religion and politics. For those 3 days, the court lived in suspended breath. Outside the palace walls, London continued in its winter gloom, unaware that the king who had reshaped the nation lay lifeless inside Whitehall, surrounded by the smoke of burning incense and the hush of men preparing for a new and uncertain reign. In February of the year 1547, the funeral of Henry VIII was held with all the weight and sombre grandeur that a monarch of his power demanded. On the 16th day of that month, London awoke beneath a sky the colour of ash, and preparations for the final procession began before dawn. From Whitehall to the Chapel of St. George at Windsor, the route stretched long and dark, transformed into a corridor of mourning. Black cloth hung from windows, draped over walls, and covered the very ground the procession would cross, turning the king's last journey into a river of shadow. More than 1,000 people took part in the slow, deliberate march. At the front rode the Knights of the Order of the Garter, each holding a burning torch whose flame flickered against their armor. Behind them came heralds, nobles, diplomats, and soldiers encased in heavy steel, their helmets lowered, their cloaks dyed the deepest black. The collective movement of so many feet measured, steady, echoing through the streets, felt like the heartbeat of a nation caught between grief and relief. Church bells rang out in mournful tones, their sound carrying across rooftops and courtyards, mingling with the low, unbroken murmur of prayers whispered by the crowd. Those gathered along the streets watched in silence as the king's coffin passed before them, covered in a vast sheet of black velvet. Atop it rested a wax effigy shaped in Henry's likeness, dressed in regal garments, complete with jewels and ermine. The figure stared forward, with an expression of calm authority, as though the king still surveyed his kingdom. For many, that silent face was unnerving, a final reminder of the ruler who had reshaped England with force, ambition, and unyielding will. The coffin itself was carried upon a large carriage drawn by 8 black horses. Their hooves struck the earth in slow, deliberate rhythms, each step measured like the toll of a distant drum. Thick plumes of breath rose from their nostrils in the cold February air, creating a ghostly mist around the procession. Despite their size and power, they moved almost reverently, as though aware of the weight they bore, not merely the body of a king, but the legacy of a man who had altered the spiritual and political map of England forever. The journey to Windsor took 2 days. The procession halted at various points along the way to allow priests to chant prayers, read scripture, and offer blessings for the king's soul. Monks and clerics in dark robes surrounded the coffin during each stop, their voices rising and falling in steady waves, solemn and hypnotic. Candles flickered in the wind, incense drifted into the air, and the crowds bowed their heads as chants echoed against the stone of churches and the timber of old village houses. For some in the crowd, grief was genuine. Henry had brought stability, wealth, and power to England. For others, the sorrow was more formal than heartfelt, and among a quiet few, hidden behind lowered eyes and clasped hands, there were faint but unmistakable breaths of relief. Henry had ruled with intensity, with violence when he felt it necessary, and with a suspicion that had cost many their lives. His death, to some, marked the end of a long era of fear. When the procession finally reached Windsor, the coffin was carried into the chapel of St. George. Torches lined the walls, casting trembling patterns of light across the vaulted ceiling. The scent of incense hung thick in the air. The wax effigy was removed with great care, and the coffin was placed near the tomb of Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife of Henry, the only one who had given him a living son, and the woman he chose to rest beside in death. The irony was sharp and unmistakable. Of 6 wives, it was Jane, the quiet one, the gentle one, the one who had died before she could disappoint him, who became his eternal companion. The others, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, were absent in stone, though their stories lingered like faint echoes in the chapel's cold air. Henry had once envisioned for himself a grand tomb of gold and bronze, a magnificent monument fit for a king who believed his legacy would outshine all others. The design was elaborate, towering, soaked in the extravagance of his own self-image. But the project never reached completion. Political upheavals, religious turmoil, and financial pressures halted its construction. Time passed, and the monumental tomb was forgotten. And so, in the end, one of the most powerful figures in English history was laid to rest beneath a simple black stone. No towering sculptures, no gilded canopy, no grand display of royal pride, just a dark slab, marking the resting place of a man whose life had been anything but simple. The contrast was almost painful. A king who had lived loudly, ruled fiercely, and shaped a nation through turmoil and bloodshed, now sleeping in austere silence beneath the floor of a chapel. There, in the quiet of St. George's, Henry VIII's story settled into stillness. The clamour of his reign faded, replaced by the soft flicker of candlelight and the muted footsteps of those who passed by. A life of excess and thunder had ended in simplicity, a final, unexpected humility carved in stone. In the years after Henry's death, it seemed impossible that a figure so immense, so violent, so transformative, so tangled in contradiction, could end merely with a solemn funeral and a plain black stone. And so, almost immediately, stories began to gather around his death like mist, the most famous of them woven from equal parts disgust, fear, and divine judgment, the legend of the bleeding coffin. Before reaching Windsor, Henry's coffin was taken to Sion Abbey to rest for a single night. The building was silent, its stone walls cold from winter winds, its corridors lit only by scattered candles. There, in that dim chapel, the king's body already bloated from decay, preserved only with a hurried, imperfect embalming, began to seep. Thick, foul-smelling fluids, dark red and brown like corrupted blood, leaked from the seams of the coffin and dripped slowly onto the floor. The air grew heavy with the odor of rot, dense enough to cling to the tapestries and rise into the rafters. According to the tale repeated in later years, stray dogs crept into the chapel during the night. Drawn by the scent, they licked the liquid pooling beneath the coffin. The image was grotesque, almost theatrical. A dead king, a once mighty monarch who had broken monasteries, executed clerics, and stripped the church of its authority, now reduced to a leaking corpse beneath the jaws of wandering dogs. Catholic writers seized upon the story eagerly. To them, it was divine retribution made visible, a punishment from heaven. The king who had devoured the sheep of Christ was, in death, consumed in turn by animals at the lowest edge of creation. The 17th century historian Gilbert Burnet recorded the anecdote as a moral symbol, though he himself admitted he could not confirm its truth. Even he seemed to sense that the story was as much a reflection of Henry's reputation as it was a report of fact. And yet, when stripped of symbolism, the episode is not impossible to explain. A massive corpse, insufficiently embalmed, sealed in a wooden coffin, transported during winter, it is entirely plausible that bodily fluids could seep through. There was nothing supernatural about decomposition, but truth mattered less than meaning. People believed the story because it suited the image they already held of Henry, the breaker of ties with Rome, the destroyer of monasteries, the ruler whose hands had sent so many to the scaffold. After its night at Sion, the coffin continued on to Windsor, where the funeral rites were carried out by Bishop Stephen Gardiner. He read the service in a blend of old Latin tradition and the new Anglican form, an uneasy union of two worlds that Henry himself had spent his life straddling. Even in death, he could not belong wholly to one side. The chapel seemed to echo that contradiction. The ancient Latin prayers rising alongside English scripture, two faiths overlapping just as they had in the mind of the man they mourned. Years earlier, Henry had written a book attacking the ideas of Martin Luther, earning from the Pope the title Defender of the Faith. He had been a devout Catholic, a champion of the sacraments, a king who argued theology with confidence and pride. But later, he shattered England's bond with Rome, dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and executed those who resisted his reforms. He became both protector and destroyer, believer and rebel, one man standing astride two opposing forces. That contradiction sank into every way people remembered him. In church, his name lingered near prayers and litanies shaped by the very faith he had fractured. In whispered stories, he became a warning, a tyrant punished from beyond the grave. And in the legend of the bleeding coffin, the two versions of Henry the King, anointed by God, and the destroyer of God's own institutions, seemed to meet in one startling, unforgettable image. A monarch whose power, once absolute, dissolved into rot, myth, and judgment as soon as his breath left him. Thus the story lived on. Not because it was proven, but because it captured what people felt Henry had become a king forever, caught between faith and rebellion, reverence and fear, memory and nightmare. In life, he stood between two worlds. In death, the stories said, he never left them. In the days after the funeral ended, history began to look back at Henry VIII with a mixture of reverence, fear, and deep resentment. In the chronicles of the 16th century, Charles Wriothesley recorded that on the 28th day of January, the king departed this life at Whitehall and was buried at Windsor with great solemnity. Yet he also noted how varied the reactions of the people were. Some mourned a powerful ruler who had lifted England to the rank of a major European force. Others breathed quietly, almost guiltily, as though relieved that a storm which had raged for nearly 4 decades had finally passed. Centuries later, the writer Charles Dickens would describe Henry as a blot of blood and grease upon the history of England, an image harsh and theatrical, yet not entirely disconnected from how many saw the king's legacy. For all his achievements, Henry had left behind a trail of violence, terror, and upheaval that scarred the memory of the nation. And yet, in everyday life, Henry had once been deeply loved. In his youth he had been handsome, well-educated, vibrant with charm and talent. He composed music, rode fearlessly, excelled in jousts, debated theology with scholars, and spoke multiple languages. People had called him the Prince of Spring, a symbol of hope after England's long winter of civil war. For a brief, shining moment, he seemed to embody the perfect Renaissance monarch, strong, brilliant, graceful, and filled with promise. But that young prince faded. Slowly at first, then with accelerating speed, he disappeared beneath the weight of absolute power and the slow, merciless decay of his body. The vigor that had once defined him dissolved under layers of flesh, pain, paranoia, and suspicion. The music and laughter that once filled his court gave way to whispers, accusations, and fear. Those who had adored him in youth now flinched at his wrath. In the centuries that followed, people recalled Henry not for the refinement of his early years, but for the darker shape he eventually became. The king, with 6 marriages, the man who ordered 2 of his wives to lose their heads, the ruler whose decrees sent thousands to execution across the kingdom. He tore England from Rome, shattered the monasteries, confiscated the vast wealth of the church, and left behind religious divisions that would ripple through generations. When he ascended the throne, England was a country healing from war, hopeful for stability, eager for renewal. When he died, England was transformed, richer, yes, and more powerful, but also fractured. The authority of the crown had grown stronger, yet the unity of its people had been strained. New laws, new churches, new loyalties had rearranged the very fabric of the nation. That was Henry's legacy. Brilliant yet brutal, visionary yet destructive, a monarch who could inspire deep admiration and profound dread in the same breath. The contradictions that marked his reign, beauty and decay, joy and terror, creation and ruin, became the very lens through which he was remembered. England emerged from his rule changed forever, reshaped by a king who never did anything halfway, who drove every decision to its extreme, who shattered everything that stood in his path in order to remake the world as he imagined it. In the end, Henry left behind a kingdom strengthened by force but scarred by division, a realm both unified and torn open. His legacy, like his personality, refused to settle into simplicity. It burned brightly and bled deeply, leaving a history both glorious and stained, as tangled and intense as the man himself. In matters of faith, Henry left the deepest and most enduring mark. In his early years, when he still stood firmly with Rome, he composed a book titled Defense of the Seven Sacraments, a direct rebuttal to the teachings of Martin Luther. In it, he defended Catholic doctrine with such conviction that Pope Leo X awarded him the title Defensor Fidei, the Defender of the Faith. It was a remarkable honor, granted to a young king who seemed poised to be one of the great protectors of the Catholic world. Yet only a few years later, the same man who had championed Rome would sever all ties with it. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and wed Anne Boleyn drew him into a confrontation with the Pope, a confrontation that reshaped the entire continent. Unable to secure the annulment, Henry broke with papal authority and initiated a religious transformation that neither England nor Europe could ever reverse. He dissolved the monasteries, stripping them of land, wealth, and influence. He seized the treasures of the religious orders, redirecting their vast fortunes into the hands of the crown. Sacred texts were burned, ancient rituals were rewritten, the structure of worship was altered so profoundly that the familiar rhythms of English Christianity changed almost overnight. And at the center of this turbulent upheaval stood Henry himself, now the supreme head of a new Church of England, a religious body answerable not to Rome, but to the king upon the throne. To Catholics of his time, Henry became not the defender but the destroyer of the faith he had once sworn to uphold. They saw a monarch who had traded centuries of tradition for personal desire, dismantling holy houses and scattering monks, nuns, and priests across the land. To Protestants, however, Henry appeared as a gatekeeper who opened the path towards spiritual independence, imperfectly, inconsistently, even reluctantly, yet decisively enough to change history. And to ordinary people, he was both benefactor and tyrant. The dissolution of the monasteries brought new wealth to certain regions and new opportunities to landowners, but it also inflicted hardship on the poor who had long relied on monastic charity. Henry became a paradox embodied, the champion of national strength and the source of heavy taxes, the builder of a new order and the architect of chaos. These contradictions repeated themselves again and again throughout Henry's life. He was pious yet ruthless, capable of deep theological reflection yet prone to violent impulses. He could be brilliant, quick-witted, sharp-minded, persuasive, and just as easily reckless, driven by jealousy, pride, or desire. He believed in divine order and moral duty, yet he bent both to his will when they stood in his way. He dreamed of a unified realm, yet his decisions fractured his kingdom along religious lines that would bleed into the reigns of his children and the centuries that followed. By the time Henry died, his religious legacy was already impossible to categorize neatly. Protestants remembered him as the king who planted the seeds of reform. Catholics remembered him as the monarch who ripped England from the heart of Christendom. Scholars saw a ruler caught between conviction and self-interest, between devotion and brutality. Families across England lived with the consequences of his policies, some benefiting from new lands and new freedoms, others living through uncertainty, fear, and division. His reign had reshaped the spiritual map of the nation so thoroughly that no successor could undo or fully complete what he had begun. Even in his funeral rites, conducted partly in Latin and partly in the newer Anglican form, Henry seemed to hover between two faiths. The ceremony itself reflected the indecision and tension that had defined his religious journey. Old prayers intertwined with new practices, as though the kingdom itself could not decide whether to honor the Catholic prince he once was, or the Protestant-leaning sovereign he became. In those final moments, even as he lay in silence beneath a wax effigy, Henry still occupied the space between two worlds. He resembled an axe driven squarely into the trunk of history, splitting it cleanly, irrevocably into two diverging paths. On one side lay the centuries of tradition he had shattered. On the other, the uncertain future he had forced into being. And behind him stretched a society permanently divided by the very reforms that gave him his most enduring legacy. For centuries to come, the name of Henry VIII would carry not just power, but tension, haunting England, with the echo of a ruler who could never be contained within any simple moral frame. From a political perspective, Henry VIII strengthened royal authority to a degree England had never witnessed before. He shaped the kingdom into a sharply centralized state, a realm where every thread of power led back to the throne and where the will of the king stood above all other forces. In that pursuit, he removed quietly at first, then openly and without hesitation any figure who might challenge or overshadow him. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, once his most trusted advisor; Thomas More, the brilliant chancellor whose conscience defied him; Thomas Cromwell, the architect of his reforms; and numerous nobles whose influence stretched too far for Henry's comfort. Their falls were not merely the eruptions of a temperamental king. They were calculated acts, political blows delivered to ensure that no man in England could stand taller than the monarch himself. Every execution echoed through the court like a warning bell. Heads that fell to the axe served as reminders that loyalty was conditional, that favour could shatter without notice, and that proximity to Henry was as dangerous as it was prestigious. Over time, fear settled into the walls of the palace, into the whispered conversations of courtiers, into the cautious glances exchanged in dim corridors. Henry had crafted a world in which absolute control was his, and his alone. Yet alongside these ruthless purges, Henry undertook sweeping reforms that transformed the kingdom's strength. He invested heavily in the navy, laying the groundwork for a maritime power that would flourish under later reigns. He fortified coastal defences, ordering the construction of new artillery forts to guard the realm from invasion. He adjusted financial systems, redirecting the immense wealth seized from the monasteries into royal coffers. Though often inefficient and sometimes mismanaged, these efforts nonetheless built the structural foundation that would support England's rise under Elizabeth, his daughter. But Henry's ambitions also drained the kingdom. His wars against France and Scotland consumed staggering sums. Campaigns that began with pride and patriotic rhetoric frequently ended with empty treasuries and weary soldiers. The religious upheavals he unleashed scrambled the economy, displacing entire communities of monks and nuns and disrupting the charitable networks that had long supported the poor. Even the court itself trembled beneath the constant tension of Henry's shifting moods. Lavish one month, austere the next, unpredictable always. Henry wanted England strong, but he wanted himself worshipped. He constructed a state that reflected him entirely, its power magnified, its stability fragile, its brilliance mixed with terror. And in doing so, he left behind a political inheritance, both formidable and deeply unstable. Within his own family, the legacy he handed down was even more precarious. Edward, The son for whom he had sacrificed marriages, friendships, and lives was frail from birth. After inheriting the throne at 9 years old, he ruled for only a short span before dying at 15, leaving behind a kingdom still grappling with the unfinished business of his father's reforms. Mary, Henry's elder daughter, sought to restore Catholicism with fierce determination. In her attempt to heal what she saw as religious wounds, she turned to persecution, earning a reputation for bloodshed that would darken her name in history. Elizabeth, the daughter Henry, once dismissed because she was not a son, became the ruler who finally steadied the ship he had set rocking. It was she who guided England back toward balance, who bridged some of its divisions, who carried the realm into a new era of culture, exploration, and identity. But even she ruled in the long, unavoidable shadow of her father. His religious fractures shaped her policies, his political centralization shaped her authority, his debts, both financial and ideological, shaped her strategies. Each of his children lived with the ghosts Henry left behind. The schisms in faith, the hollowed treasury, the tense and weary society unsure of its direction. They inherited a kingdom made powerful by his decisions and wounded by them in equal measure. The Tudor dynasty glowed bright, but its flame wavered beneath the weight of what he had set in motion. Henry built the foundation for modern English power, but he built it in a way that forced 3 successive monarchs, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, to struggle with the unresolved turmoil he bequeathed. His reign was a towering monument of ambition, brilliance, and brutality, and the generations that followed bore the cost of holding up the structure he left behind. Looking back across the entire span of Henry VIII's life, one sees a slow passage from brilliant light into a thick and consuming darkness. In his youth, he seemed almost crafted for the ideals of the Renaissance. A king both formidable and dazzling, blessed with strength, beauty, and learning. He played music with ease, composed verses, told stories with charm, and moved through court like a figure carved from legend. Ambassadors marveled at him. Poets praised him. His people adored him. For a moment, England believed it had found a perfect sovereign, a prince who embodied grace and power in equal measure. But absolute authority, gnawing illness, and the relentless pressure to produce a male heir reshaped him into something harsher, heavier, and far less harmonious. What began as confidence hardened into suspicion. What began as vigor deteriorated into pain. The brilliant young king dimmed gradually until he became a distorted reflection of the man he once had been. His 6 marriages form a line of tragedies that shadow his legacy. Catherine of Aragon, loyal and steadfast, endured years of humiliation before being cast aside. Anne Boleyn, once the fiery hope of a new dynasty, lost her life beneath the blade. Jane Seymour, who finally gave him a son, died shortly after childbirth. Anne of Cleves survived only because Henry found her unattractive and preferred to send her away rather than condemn her. Catherine Howard, young and frightened, followed Anne Boleyn to the scaffold. Catherine Parr, the last wife, escaped death by a narrow margin and lived in constant tension under the roof of a king whose moods were as unpredictable as storms. These women were not merely companions. They were woven into the machinery of Henry's politics, his fears, and his obsessions. Each marriage was both intimate and strategic, personal and national. Henry loved intensely, distrusted deeply, and destroyed swiftly. Those impulses, entangled with the demands of succession and the shifting tides of international diplomacy, created a cycle that consumed almost everyone who stood too close to him. On the broader stage, Henry became a paradox made flesh. He founded the Church of England, breaking centuries of obedience to Rome, yet he never fully abandoned the ceremonial splendor or doctrinal instincts of the faith he left behind. He shattered monasteries, scattering relics, libraries, and ancient communities, yet he presented himself as the guardian of order and divine authority. He expanded the reach of the crown, centralizing power with a force no English king before him had achieved, while at the same time fracturing social structures that had anchored the realm for generations. Still, the question that has troubled historians for centuries concerns the true nature of Henry himself. Was he a monster shaped by cruelty and appetite from the beginning? Or was he a man gradually twisted by circumstance, cornered by the anxiety of succession, tormented by chronic pain, and pressured by the unforgiving politics of Europe? Was he a tyrant by temperament, or did time, illness, and disappointment erode the gentler qualities he once possessed? There is no single answer. Henry resists containment, slipping away from neat moral judgments. He was, at various moments, both brilliant and reckless, both noble and brutal. The man who charmed scholars with elegant theological debates was the same man who signed death warrants with startling ease. The king who dreamed of unity left behind division. The ruler who sought a secure succession plunged his dynasty into uncertainty. He was fiercely intelligent, yet blinded by pride. He was capable of loyalty, yet easily consumed by jealousy. He protected the nation with one hand, while tearing at its fabric with the other. In the end, Henry VIII was all these things at once, radiant and shadowed, triumphant and disgraceful, magnificent and terrifying. His reign stands like a massive, unmovable monument, one side gleaming with achievement, the other stained with blood and fear. To study him is to confront the full complexity of power itself, its seductions and corruptions, its grandeur and its ruin. Henry was never simple. He was never gentle. He was a king who carved his name into history with force enough to echo through centuries, leaving behind a legacy as conflicted and colossal as the man himself. And then, when everything had finally fallen silent, the reign, the wars, the fallen heads, the shattered marriages, Henry VIII lay beneath a single slab of black stone. A quiet, almost austere ending for a man who had once made all of Europe tremble. Yet that simplicity only made his memory feel heavier, like a shadow stretching across the centuries. Generations passed, but his name did not fade. It lingered in sermons, in chronicles, in the murmurs of those who tried to understand how one man could alter the fate of a kingdom with such force and with such ruin. Under that dark stone at Windsor, Henry rested beside Jane Seymour, the one wife he chose to share eternity with. Around him, the chapel remained cool and dim, its arches rising like silent witnesses to everything he had done. The quiet might have seemed peaceful to anyone who did not know the weight of the life buried there. But for those who remembered, the silence held echoes. The rattle of chains from the tower, the shouts of soldiers preparing for war, the cries of children left without parents after his purges, the whispered prayers of those who hoped to survive his unpredictable temper. Henry had reshaped the religious map of Europe. With one decision, the break from Rome, he severed a bond that had held for centuries. He closed monasteries that had stood longer than his dynasty, tore apart communities that had prayed in the same cloisters for generation after generation. He set England on a path toward a new church, a new identity, a new sense of spiritual independence. Without him, the Church of England would not exist in the form it does today. Without him, the faith practiced across the country would have taken a different shape, perhaps gentler, perhaps slower to change. He had also torn his nation into pieces. Families found themselves divided by belief. The poor who had relied on monastic charity wandered with nowhere to go. The wealthy scrambled for land newly seized from the church. A kingdom that once moved to a single rhythm now pulsed with dissonance, its heart beating in fragments. Henry had dreamed of unity, yet his reforms carved deep fissures that stretched far beyond his lifetime. But it would be false to say his legacy was only destruction. Without Henry, Elizabeth, the greatest monarch England would ever know, would never have ascended the throne. She carried both his flame and his burden, building upon the foundations he left, scattered and uneven. From his chaos emerged her order, from his storms emerged her golden age. Henry was the force that cleared the ground, violently and without mercy. Elizabeth was the one who planted on that broken soil. Even so, the human cost of Henry's reign cannot be softened. Thousands died under his commands, rebels, monks, courtiers, servants, 2 wives. He reshaped the law to suit his needs, twisted justice into a tool of fear, and allowed paranoia to guide his hand. The Tower of London became a revolving door of prisoners, many of them innocent, all of them terrified. Families collapsed, names were erased, and hopes were cut short by a single royal signature. Henry's England was a place where life could change or end overnight. He was a storm, violent and uncontrollable, the kind that sweeps across a landscape leaving nothing untouched. Trees fall, houses crumble, rivers overflow, but when the skies finally clear, the soil is strangely rich, ready for something new to grow. Henry was that storm, destructive, terrifying, unpredictable, yet followed by renewal. His daughter's reign flourished in the wide, turbulent space he had created. His body has long since decayed, returning to dust beneath the stone at Windsor. But the mark he left upon history has not faded. It endures in churches, in laws, in the very structure of English identity. It endures in the sharp debates of historians, who still cannot agree on who he truly was. It endures in the stories told about him, some true, some exaggerated, all revealing a fascination that no other king attracts so strongly. Henry VIII remains a scar carved deep into the history of Europe, dark, jagged, unforgettable. A king who died in pain, lived in the shadows of his own power, and reshaped a nation that could never return to what it had been before him. A tyrant and a founder, a destroyer and a builder, a man of brilliance and a man of brutality forever. One of the most indelible figures in the long and troubled story of England.